Right, so the marmalade-skinned warmongering muppet that is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is verging on bringing about the next major conflict to hit the Middle East if he is stupid enough to launch an attack on Iran, the most powerful nation in the Middle East, the most heavily armed by all accounts, a conflict that could dwarf the devastation seen in previous US-backed atrocities such as Iraq, Afghanistan or Syria. Trump's increasingly aggressive foreign policy has ramped up military threats against Iran because this is what passes for his diplomacy, isn't it? The aggression, the bullying, the attempted intimidation, now seeing him moving warships, bombers and missile defense systems into the region. Yet unlike past adversaries, Iran is not backing down. Instead, they've handed Trump his backside on a plate before a single shot has been fired. You see, they've taken unprecedented steps already to neutralise all American military advantages, even as Trump moves more assets into the region, securing the refusal of at least 6 neighbouring Arab states to allow US forces to use their airspace for potential strikes on Iran. Not exactly the behaviour of a nation cowed by American threats, is it, or Trump's blowing of hot air? It's the calculated defiance of a country that has spent decades preparing for this exact scenario and has the assets, it is alleged, to match, capable of giving the US a very bad day. Words that have come from former US advisers on such matters at that. Iran's leadership has made it clear, if the US attacks, all down to the breakdown in negotiations over a nuclear program that doesn't include nuclear weapons anyway, banned as they are in Iran, it will face a response unlike anything it has encountered in the Middle East before. And with Trump's reckless posturing, the world may soon witness a war that could humiliate the US military, destabilise the global economy even more than Trump's idiotic tariffs have done, and drag the entire region and possibly beyond into absolute chaos. Right, so the US has been rapidly deploying military assets around Iran in what it claims is a deterrent against potential aggression, all because Iran won't just jump to Trump's tune over its nuclear research and development, an issue that has been made into an issue by Israel, demanding that Iran be dealt with, as they have been doing now for years, with claims they are in possession of or are researching nuclear weapons and that this must be prevented at all costs. Never mind Israel supposedly having nukes themselves with no oversight over theirs whatsoever either. Mutually assured hypocrisy, you might say. Netanyahu has been dreaming of the US taking on by far the biggest threat to them and their expansionist existence in Iran for years. And this might be the closest Netanyahu's ever gotten to it becoming a reality. But far from being a weak target as the US prefers to take on, Iran reputedly possesses the means to retaliate in ways that could cripple American allies and interests in the region. One of the most telling indicators of US concerns for its precious ally Israel, and one that Iran won't have missed, is the recent deployment of a second Terminal High Altitude Area Defense THAAD system to Israel. Now, genocide Joe Biden sent one of these last year to Israel, as it became obvious the Iron Dome defense system and the others that Israel got, like Arrow and David Sling, were not stopping the rockets being fired at them by Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, amongst others. And with the Houthis having renewed strikes on Israel since the collapse of the Gaza ceasefire, this second THAAD suggests that Israel's air defences have not been rebuilt and have not recovered during the ceasefire, would likely account for the success and how far-reaching Houthi strikes on Israel have been, and how absolutely vulnerable to an Iranian barrage, as is still expected following Israel's last strike on Iranian territory last year, would actually be. So with talks surrounding Iran's nuclear assets having descended to Trump's level of shouting, stamping his tiny feet and taking a do-it-or-else attitude to such matters, Iran is no longer listening and they've walked away. They don't fear the US. The opposite is completely possible to be true, and this comes off the back of recent comments made by a former Reagan administration official called Paul Roberts, who has said on the matter, B-52 bombers will never enter Iranian airspace. They will be blown out of the skies, so you won't be able to bomb anything. And any fighter jets leaving aircraft carriers will not be able to enter Iranian airspace. They will be blown out of the skies. And if the information we have is correct, then Iran has enormous numbers of long-range missiles that are hypersonic. We will lose every aircraft carrier you have deployed in the region, and it will be a humiliating naval and air defeat for the United States. Now, Roberts has also cautioned that intelligence on Iranian assets may not also be correct, and he has also postulated that Iran may not even use such an arsenal if it does possess it, in case Trump is insane enough to then escalate and take a nuclear option. But then the question arises as to whether anyone in the Trump administration would step in before little Donnie pressed the big red button on all of our destruction, as the use of nukes would then surely lead to. Well, reports right now indicate that the US has indeed been amassing forces around Iran, including bombers, carrier strike groups, and those additional missile defense systems for Israel. So on the surface, this appears to be a show of strength, but it's been turned back on Trump as Iran revealed a critical vulnerability, shall we put it, because for all of the US's strength on show here, they've got no viable land bases from which to launch a sustained air campaign against Iran, because Iran have made sure of that. Twist in the tail here, the most striking development in this standoff has been the refusal of 6 key Arab nations, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to allow the US to use their airspace for strikes on Iran, which is a monumental setback for American war planners, because the US possesses military bases in some of these that are now going to be denied to them should they choose to attack Iran. That's the entire Arabian Peninsula. Yemen certainly won't let them launch from there either, after all, and Bahrain, as the only other nation to mention here, would be fools to try it, leaving the only viable place to launch attacks from outside the likes of Israel or Jordan, who are also well within Iran's range as well from the mainland. The US is left with just one option, fundamentally, the British overseas territory of Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and not an insignificant distance away as that is, or from its own aircraft carriers, of course, which, as Paul Roberts warned, would not be invulnerable to Iranian strikes either, in his view. It's not hard to work out why these states have immediately come out and told the US to forget it, because all of them are aware of Iran's rumoured capabilities. Therefore, the biggest reason for them to say no to Trump is fear of Iranian retaliation. Iran has explicitly warned that any country facilitating US attacks will itself become a target. Given Iran's alleged missile arsenal, Gulf states know that hosting US strikes on Iran would mean inviting destruction upon their own cities, not to mention the region's precious oil infrastructure, all of these 6 nations being oil producers or involved in the oil industry somewhere, of course. Aside from Iran, though, all 6 of these Arab states would also be entirely justified in not trusting Donald Trump one iota, not trusting him any further than they could throw him. He's a reckless bully and a raging liability, not just to them, but to the US as well. They will be observing the exchanges between the Trump administration and Iran and seeing Trump's foreign policy here as erratic and self-serving and not achieving any of its stated aims, but destabilizing the entire region instead. And then it's that point that brings us back to the oil, of course, the economic impact of the US taking on Iran. A US-Iran war would undoubtedly send oil prices skyrocketing, but would also risk devastating the Gulf's own oil facilities, as seen in the 2019 Abqaiq attacks, when Yemen's Houthis launched a strike on Saudi oil facilities, though the blame was firmly slapped on Iran by the West. The strike succeeded in halving Saudi Arabia's oil exports for a time, wiping 5% off global daily oil production in one stroke. A repeat of that or worse would want to be avoided by all concerned. These nations are not willing to sacrifice their economies for Trump's idiocy and thuggery. So with Arab nations refusing access and the US now restricted to launching strikes on aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea and Diego Garcia at this point, this severely limits the scale and effectiveness of any potential US bombing campaign. Unlike for example, the 2003 Iraq War, where the US had regional bases in Kuwait and Qatar and Saudi Arabia to launch from, and indeed now has bases in Iraq itself, though for how much longer is another question, Iraq wanting the US out themselves, Washington now faces the prospect of a logistical nightmare here, with very long-distance sorties reducing rates of attack and increasing vulnerability. Iran, for its part, is not sitting idle either, not trading on what others think they've got stashed away out of sight. The country's military has been placed on high alert, with its missile forces dispersed and ready, and with Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini having issued a stern warning, saying, "We will not start a war, but if attacked, we will respond with decisive force." And certainly we've seen that when Israel chose to attack them on 2 occasions, Iran quite readily responded. And of course, Israel have attacked them for a 3rd time since then, and the response from Iran is still waited for and expected, and they keep saying it's going to come at some point. But right now they've got other things to be thinking about, shall we say. So what are we looking at anyway if Trump pushes ahead with these strikes then? For one, it would be a great big military mess, in my view. Unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, when the US went to war there, Iran has a modern military, a homegrown arms industry, and strategic depth, not to mention logistics and home turf advantage. As Paul Roberts explained, a US invasion is impossible. Attempted airstrikes would see aircraft taken out, and in his view, certainly, the US would get absolutely nowhere and could be so badly battered, the humiliation could take years to ever recover from. Speaking of home turf advantage, even the geography of the region is on Iran's side. Iran could close down the Strait of Hormuz, the bottleneck where the Persian Gulf meets the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, which would cut off 20% of the world's oil supply. And that would trigger an economic crisis far exceeding the Abqaiq attack. And then there's the regional aspect, where Arabian states refuse to help the US fight Iran. Iran has those in its axis of resistance who would likely aid them. The Houthis in Yemen particularly would be likely to contribute, but equally so could other regional actors too. Iraqi militias like Islamic Resistance possibly, and perhaps even Hezbollah. And then there would be the global backlash against the US as well as fallout if they do get humiliated and take on Iran. Russia and China would have an absolute field day at American expense, wouldn't they? Europe, who have already been critical of Trump's Iran policy and now on the receiving end of his tariff obsession, would condemn him as well. And oil prices would surge, potentially crashing economies worldwide. And just like the tariffs, this too would be all on Donald Trump. Fundamentally, this is not a fight the US will come out on top of. Trump's threats against Iran are not a sign of strength. They're a desperate gamble by an administration that has cornered itself with its maximalist demands. Trump goes straight for the most extreme act, thinking it makes him look big and tough. But when it doesn't work, he's got nowhere to escalate from there except to do the unthinkable. Iran, by contrast, has outmaneuvered the US both diplomatically and militarily, secured regional support that denies Washington the bases it needs for effective strikes. Bullying doesn't work against a prepared adversary, and where the US might think of Iran as barbaric and primitive, and where much of the media coverage about them exacerbates that stereotype, the reality is the total opposite. Instead of repeating the mistakes of Iraq, Trump should step back from the brink before his bluster drags America into another unwinnable war, especially one that, as everything in the Middle East seems to stem from, all amounts to just jumping to Israel's tune. To be honest, it's not as if Trump isn't losing enough US cash in the Middle East without adding the expense of war with Iran to the tally, as it's just emerged that just fighting the Houthis on their own for the last 3 weeks has already cost the US $1 billion and made absolutely no difference whatsoever as the Houthis continue to strike US warships as well as Israel, often whilst being attacked themselves at the same time. They can't handle the Houthis based in the poorest nation in the Middle East. What chance has he got against reputedly the most powerful nation? Get all the details of Trump's latest Houthi rinsing in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as supporting the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.